Hello, I'm Niall Kelly. As I'll show you, I'm something of a slow learner because I had chronic pain for far too many years, and it was only after my back went into spasm for the nth time following bypass surgery in 2001 that I decided it was time to do something about it. When I was 19, I got caught in a scrum collapse. I was playing tight head prop, and after the match I thought everything was okay. But 7 years later, I had my first spasm out of the blue. I bent over to fix something on my son's shoes, and bang, it went. I was taken to the doctor, where I was introduced to a whole new ritual, which was drop your pants, get a shot in the backside, and wait till your leg went numb. And that killed off the spasm. That was fine, but what I noticed was I started to get back pain, which I had no experience of prior to that. And over time, the pain would go to sciatica, and the two of them would eventually go to more spasms. And I would repeat through this cycle where I would be treated with the ritual injection and sent on my way. I tried all sorts of doctors and specialists, and I eventually ended up in traction for a particularly bad spasm. During that, they told me that they were thinking of surgery to cut back the ruptured disc and to probably fuse the vertebrae in my back. Fortunately, I got fed up with lying around in traction. I signed myself out and went home, and I avoided the surgery. That is, until after the bypass surgery, I was having a bath in which I fell asleep. I woke up, the water was cold, and I leaned forward to turn on the taps, the hot tap, and my back went again. Again, I got the injection into my backside, dead leg, and off we went. But fortunately, this time, I had heard about the Alexander technique, and I decided to try it, and I studied it. And I qualified in 2004, and since then I've been teaching in UL on the performance programs. And I'm in the fortunate position now that if I detect oncoming pain, I know exactly what to do to head it off. And so that is what's allowed me be virtually pain-free. So what is the Alexander technique? Well, many think it's about posture and back pain, as I did. And while that's true to a degree, it's nowhere near the whole story. Alexander himself said it's about the inhibition of unwanted and undesirable responses to stimuli. And as such, it's a process for the development of human reaction. Put simply, it's about not jumping when you hear a balloon burst or a loud noise. The jumping is something of a learned response, and we have time between when we hear it and our brain decides we need to do something to stop that and do something different. We evolved to stand upright. We stand on our feet with our legs supporting our pelvis, our torso, spine and head. And we move into something of a neutral balance or a neutral posture. And it's very interesting to watch small children learning to walk. There's a lot of tottering and losing balance and falling down and getting back up and going at it again. And that's the system designed to bring us into the upright that we use. Now, lots of people say that it's the wrong design, and it may well be, but the fact of the matter is it's the design we have. And we can decide to go with the limitations, or we can work with them and avoid things like back pain and indeed other pain. So the structure is inherently unstable, and it requires constant micro movement in the legs and ankles in order to stay up. It's a bit like a spinning top. Once the rotation stops, it falls over. But many experiences cause us to tighten up and interfere with that easy micro movement. I'm sure you've had the experience of hitting your funny bone, as I have several times, and watched many others to my great delight. The funny bone creates those weird sensations that are shooting to our brain, making us not know whether to laugh or cry. But in order to stop the whole thing, we scrunch in and tighten and sometimes howl. And it's not just the funny bone that does it. Stub your toe off a step or crack your shin off a low table and you'll tighten. And equally, injury, illness, acute illness, shock and trauma cause us to tighten. So there's a lot of stimuli there to tighten us. Not only that, but we have designed an environment which shapes us as well. We sit in chairs for lengthy periods of time, either lounging or sitting at a desk, leaning into a computer. We sit in cars, commuting to and from work, or driving around the country for work. And we spend time on our phones. And all of these create what's called forward head posture, where our head is going out like this into space as we look at our phone or into our computer or in our car. And all of this forward head posture interferes with our natural posture and puts a lot of strain on our neck muscles and shoulder muscles. And you know this is happening around you. If it's not happening to you yourself, you're hearing people getting out of chairs and cars and really groaning with the discomfort. And long before cars and computers and phones, Alexander said, we translate everything we do into muscle tension, whether physical, mental or emotional. And so his real thrust in his technique was to avoid this automatic tightening or unconscious tightening. So why are posture and tightening important? Well, the American Journal of Pain Management in 1994 published an article which said posture affects every aspect of our life, including breath and hormonal production. It gives rise to spinal pain, headaches, mood, blood pressure, pulse, and lung capacity, among many other things, are readily influenced by posture. Professor René Kellier, who was the professor of rehabilitative medicine in the University of Southern California's School of Medicine, said it can give rise to an up to 30% loss of breath capacity. Now that's quite a size, and this is caused by bending over desks and tables and looking into computers and tightening the abdominal muscles and the rib muscles, really cramping up the space we have for our lungs to move, and it drives us into upper chest breathing. It also gives rise to a loss of flexibility and mobility, and it gives rise to the number one cause of medical referrals for over 60s in the USA, constipation. So when I ask people what they think posture is, they say, well, it's how I hold myself. And to be honest, that was what I thought, because I did a lot of holding. Well, it's the exact opposite. Posture is a dynamic process of coordinating our different parts in balance so that we can use minimum muscle effort and allow the bones to carry our weight. And the muscle tightening leads to holding, whereas the dynamic coordination and balancing is what we need. Alexander came about this because in his early 20s he wanted to be an actor. And so he would go on stage most evenings and recite great tracts of Shakespeare and other ballads and epic poems. But he found he was getting hoarse and losing his voice. And he was going to his doctors. Beyond the ordinary, gargle and take the honey and lemon, they were offering him nothing. And he had an opportunity of a very important contract, and he saw the doctors and they said, well, look, maybe the best thing to do is rest your voice for a while and see how that goes. So he didn't speak for a week. And at the end of the week, his voice was perfect. So he signed the contract. But unfortunately, he had to give it up on the first night. And he went back to his doctors, and again they said, look, there's nothing wrong, it's just hoarseness. And he had quite a brilliant insight. He said, all right, if you're telling me there's nothing clinically wrong with my voice, and it's fine when I rest it, then maybe it's got to do with the way I use myself on stage. And that was the term he used. How he used himself on stage. They agreed with him. And he went off and set up mirrors in a U shape so that he could see himself from every angle. And he set about watching what it is he does when he performs. And he soon found that he was pulling his head back and down. Now, it may have been something that he wanted to do in order to project into the auditorium, because they had no amplification then. He also realized that he was tightening his back, and it may have been something of a theatrical stance to go with the pulling of his head and just appear very, very professional. What he didn't realize was the degree to which he was gasping for breath. And when he discussed it with his brother and others, they said, "Of course you do. We listen to you every night in the hall. We can hear you from the back." Unexpectedly, he realized he was holding a lot of tension in his legs and in his feet. And the interesting thing about that was the stages of the time were raked so that the audience had a nice perspective view. But for the actor, it felt like they were sliding down the stage, and their directors would say to them, "Oh, grip the stage with your feet," forgetting, of course, that they're wearing shoes and still sliding down the stage. So all of that pattern gave rise to some very important insights for him, which I'll go to in a moment. But first, have you ever had that sinking feeling in your gut when you got bad news or something happened? Well, it's a real physiological effect. It's nothing ephemeral. It's caused by your brain switching the blood supply from your intestine to the muscles in the belief that you're under threat. Because such is the effect of the bad news or the shock. The brain immediately thinks you're under threat and decides you need to fight this. But we don't understand that. And we can just feel that sensation, and thinking that we're literally coming apart with the news, we tighten up to hold ourselves together. So it's tightening, tightening, tightening. Everything is designed apparently to tighten us. The neuroscientists now say that a lot of what we're feeling, such as the sinking feeling in the gut, is physiology, meaning that it is data streams coming in from all of these millions of sensors that we have throughout the body, in all of our muscles and in the organs, to inform the brain what's going on. And a lot of the brain computing space is tied up with that, and we don't notice it. It's got nothing to do with us on a day-to-day basis. But when it changes, we do. And the data streams are streams of electrochemical energy, or energy in motion. And the neuroscientists are now saying this is the basis of emotion. And the emotion drives our feelings. And our feelings drive our thoughts drive our behavior, and we respond. And when it's a shock, we tighten. And Alexander also recognized this back in the day, 100 years ago and more. And he said this is faulty sensory appreciation, or faulty sensory interpretation. We think something is happening and it's not. So I want to share the 3-part action plan to stop over-tightening and hopefully alleviate chronic pain for you. It's quite straightforward. It involves lying down. I bet you can do that. It involves breathing and aimed. And no, that's not a typo, as I'll explain in a moment. So the lie down. Well, this is no ordinary lie down. This is an Alexander technique lie down. It requires you getting yourself a draft-free room, because you can get chilled lying there. Use a yoga mat to take you off the floor, because the floor can be uncomfortable. And if you haven't got a yoga mat, use a blanket or a quilt or something like that. And get 3 or 4 books of about this height, the height of your 3 fingers, and place them behind your head, just at the pole, not at the neck, so that there's a good gap between the books and your neck. And as you lie on the mat, bring your knees up so that your feet are flat on the floor and hip width apart and parallel. And that's going to take a little bit of checking to know that that's right, because most people will lie with their feet turned out, or some with their feet turned in. So check that and get them parallel, hip width apart, and then send the knees towards the ceiling. Just the thought of sending them so that the muscles on either side of the thighs are balanced. Don't allow them fall in on each other, and don't allow them fall out. And as you're there, allow yourself to be there. Consciously give yourself permission to be there. Now, when I started this, I found it very difficult. I needed to find excuses to get up and do something, because lying on the floor was not my thing, doing nothing. So no TV, you don't need the news. No radio. And if you do listen to music, try to listen to something soft and gentle that's not rhythmic and drawing you into different patterns of thinking. Don't do the shopping or any other list. Notice how you are contacting the floor. Do your shoulders touch the floor, or are they up in the air? Is your back on the floor, or is it arched? Or, just notice what's going on without any intention of changing, and be prepared to allow the change to take place. And I'll show you why that's important in a few minutes. I'll be explaining directing, and what you're doing is directing your brain to let go of the muscle tension when you notice it. And even if you don't notice it, just tell your brain you don't need to hold the tension, because you're not going to fall off the floor. Very few people ever have. And as you're doing this, you may notice muscles beginning to slide apart very gently, or they might jump apart, or actually jerk apart, like that jerk you get when you're falling asleep. And it's all okay. With regard to the breathing, Alexander came up with a very interesting model, which he called the whispered ah. It's a very easy way to restore natural breathing. We spend a lot of time interfering with our breathing, as you heard, because of our posture. We also interfere with it because of speaking. Listen to many of the television news reporters and weather reporters, and you'll hear them gasping very sharply to take in their breath so that they continue without losing time. Or listen to politicians. They breathe all the way out to the very end, and they take a quick gasp of breath in, because they know if they create the gap, the opposition is in. So the whispered ah is about restoring natural breathing. And it starts off with thinking of something funny, because it helps the muscles relax. The idea of you're lying on the floor and your family seeing you there may be funny enough for you, or, there's lots of things going on in your life that are funny. Allow your jaw to release. Don't actually open your mouth, but just allow it to drop down in the way you would allow your arm to drop down. Let your tongue flatten your mouth, and when your mouth is open, exhale. Just your breath to the end without pushing it. But do make a whispered ah sound. It's barely audible, and it sounds a bit like this. You're not trying to prolong it. It's not a competition. It's just exhaling quietly. When you get to the end of the exhalation, close your mouth and wait. Wait for your natural breath to come back in itself. You have an amazing breathing center in the brainstem, which manages your breathing for you. And if you don't think so, who's breathing at night? You go to bed every night, you fall asleep, don't think about your breathing, and it works away absolutely perfectly. As I said, we interfere with that. As you inhale, inhale through the nose, and think of inhaling into your back, because there's quite a bit of your lungs in towards the back. It's not all just to the front, it's front and back. And we don't think of that as a space to use, but by thinking of breathing into our back, we can allow an extra expansion. And because we've learned to release the tension lying on the floor, we can feel our ribs moving a little bit more laterally, which is how they should. Diaphragm goes down and the ribs just push out a little bit and then fall back in again. So the cycle is and so on. Do that as many times as you wish. What's wonderful about this is it automatically slows your breath. And between the muscles releasing and your breath slowing down and your smiling, your brain is reading all of these messages and thinking, there are no saber-toothed tigers here. There's no threat. And even if you are worried about something, your brain is reading your physiology. And as long as you're lying down, releasing, breathing and smiling, your brain will go with you. And it will move you from the state we're principally in, the fight, flight or fear, into rest and digest. And rest and digest is literally where we have the blood coming back into our intestine and the brain thinks, well, things must be okay. So it's reinforcing those messages, and we move into a deep calm and give ourselves the potential for healing. We increase our blood flow through the body, and if there's soreness or inflammation in the muscles, we can increase the oxygen flow through those areas and increase healing. So the whispered ah is the closest thing we have to natural breathing. We don't have to worry about these very structured models that are out there, like box breathing or 5 in, 6 hold, 7 out, 8 hold, 5 in, and quite honestly, I get lost with them. It's really interesting how in the movie The King and I, Anna said to her son, "Whenever I feel afraid, I hold my head erect, I whistle a happy tune, and no one will suspect I'm afraid." That's 1956, and yet the scientists, the neuroscientists today are saying the way to go through life is to strike the pose, open up. Your brain feels your head being supported on your spine. It doesn't feel you crunching in, and it radiates a picture of calm. Working with the students, I realized, as many of them are doing Gregorian chant, that Gregorian chant is a whispered ah. It's a beautiful whispered ah to that beautiful Gregorian music, and it's a long exhalation and a soft intake of breath and a long exhalation. And it really speaks to why monks who chant, either Gregorian chant or other world chants, are very calm individuals, because they spend a lot more time in that state of calm than in that frenetic state that we are in. It's not that they don't worry or have the same difficulties with life, but they have got their breathing and they're staying quiet. So if chanting and whistling are not your cup of tea, you can always hum. The same sort of vibrations of the humming go through the body and tell the brain you're okay. Brains know you don't hum in the presence of saber-toothed tigers. And so it goes into calm. Let's look at the aimed piece. It's awareness, A for awareness, I for inhibition, M for means whereby, D for directions, and E for expansion and effortlessness. Awareness. We're not very good at detecting small changes either inside us or outside. And it's very interesting, we can sit in a room in the evening time, in the summer particularly, and as it's cooling down very slowly, we suddenly realise we're chilled. And we're wondering, how did that happen? I never noticed. Well, we don't, because it's not necessary. There are too many things going on around us for our physiology to track that watching temperature just dropping incrementally is not a high priority. But noticing the step change is. And so we go off and get the sweater. At the time when my back was sore, I did a lot of bracing, and very interestingly, physiotherapists and doctors would tell me to brace and hold myself so as not to move suddenly, because that was when I would trigger a spasm. And so I was bracing on top of the bracing. And I didn't realize how much that bracing was pulling me out of shape. In fact, it was very interesting. My wife could see how I was tightening up, and she would eventually say to me, "Is your back at you?" And I would kind of say to her, would you stop asking me that question? Every time you ask me, is my back at me, I go into spasm. And I would. Inhibition, stop. Just means stop. Stop doing the action or activity or habit that you're using. For me, stop bracing. And I learned to stop bracing lying on the floor. You cannot change something until you know what you're doing. So you need the awareness to know what you're doing. You need to stop, and then you need to find a new means whereby. It's just a different how. That was the term he used. You can assemble your flat pack furniture with that little screwdriver that comes with it and spend the day screwing in all those screws and end up with a sore wrist or arm or shoulder. Or you can use your electric screwdriver or electric drill. It's just finding another way of doing it. It's a bit different perhaps when we're trying to do something with the body. Directions. This is perhaps the most powerful part of what Alexander discovered. He found that brains don't work with don't instructions. It's like if I say to you, don't think of a pink elephant. Don't think of a yellow elephant. When the brain hears a don't, it almost does. And so Alexander, having tried everything to stop pulling his head back, began to realize that actually his head goes back because he tightens his neck muscles. So he took to saying to his brain directions, because he was being directed as an actor on stage: allow my neck be free. Allow my neck be free so that my head goes forward and up. Allow my neck be free so that my head goes forward and up, to allow my back lengthen and widen. And amazingly, this is exactly what happened. Now, it didn't happen instantly. It needed regular repeats until his brain began to listen to him and figure out what it was he actually meant. And this is something that you really do want to grasp if you're going to do this, because it is the most powerful part of it all. Lying down and breathing help to reduce the muscle tension in themselves, but the final releasing takes place when we give good directions. And the aimed, the awareness inhibiting means whereby and directions result in expansion. The torso expands, the muscles expand, and we can move effortlessly. And if we've been experiencing chronic pain or higher levels of chronic pain because of muscle tensioning, that certainly will reduce, if not actually be eliminated. Because the lie down, the breathing and the aimed move us from the startle, the fight and flight, into the rest and digest, where we become calm and healing can start to take place as greater circulation goes on and deeper levels of breathing start to help with healing inflammation. So to recap, doctors and therapists work without a doubt. Every time I went to the doctor, he or she would help me with alleviating the spasm. When I went to physios, they would do the same, although it was a harder way to get there. But none of them had the time or perhaps the knowledge to address aimed. And that's where the really secret sauce is. Anne came to me some years ago. She had a pain in her right shoulder. It had been giving her quite a bit of problem over the years, and she'd been to her doctors and specialists and was doing yoga and Tai Chi. And some of it seemed to help, but it was always coming back, and it was becoming an issue for her. I told her how we were going to work, which would be lying down, breathing and aimed, and I would also be using my hands to see what was going on in her shoulder and in her neck and back muscles. And I would also use my hands to give her some directions besides the verbal directions. So we worked away, and at the end of the session she said, "That's fantastic, the pain is gone." A few days later she rang and she said, "It's back." And I said, "We discussed the possibility and we'll see where it goes next week." And she came for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and it was the same pattern: improvement, back again, improvement, back again. And on one of the sessions I had my hands on her shoulder and I said, "There's something about your right shoulder that's not the same as your left. And I wonder if you'd injured your right shoulder." And she looked at me quite sharply and she said, "No, I didn't." And we finished up and she came back the next week and she said, "You know the thing about my shoulder? Well, I was home the weekend and I asked my mother, did I ever injure my shoulder? And she said, no, you didn't. But do you remember the time you fell off the wall and you broke your elbow?" And she was amazed because it had never occurred to her. She had utterly and completely forgotten. She had forgotten that they had put her into a sling and that it was painful when she was in the sling. And being a smart, creative child of 6, she realized that if she pulled the sling quite tight in the morning and pushed into it, she could reduce the discomfort and pain. And she did that for the 6 or 8 weeks. Now the problem was that pattern got built into her brain. It rewired her brain. And here she was with the same thing running again, even though she wasn't aware of it. I asked her to give me her elbow into my hand and her shoulder, and I asked her if it was healed. And she said, "Yes, of course it's healed." And I said, "Well, in that case, can you release it and let me take the weight?" And she said, "You have it." I said, "No, if I take my hands away, you're holding it up." And she struggled for a few minutes trying to make the connection between her brain and the muscles to give the exact instruction, the exact direction. And we explored that, and eventually she came up with it: allow my neck be free, my shoulder, and so on. and suddenly her shoulder released into my hand. And she looked at me wide-eyed and said, "The pain is gone." The really astounding point about that is it was almost 40 years later. That pain circuit had been running in her brain between her brain and her shoulder, unbeknownst to her. And it was holding, protecting, the way I was holding, protecting my back. But once she got it, she could let it go, and the pain went with it. Now, it's not always going to be like that, because some pain, it just releases slowly, or it jumps out or jerks out, but it's worth trying. As I said, chronic pain rewires the brain. Brains are actually quite plastic, and we are growing and losing neurons every day. But you can rewire the rewire. It happens when we lie down and the messages start going back to the brain that actually things are okay. That's added to by the breathing, because that brings us into that state of calm. And if we become aware of what we're doing and we get support or insight into how to stop it, then awareness inhibiting means whereby and direction will complete it. And in time, that circuit between the brain and the injury, or the brain and the pain, begins to dilute and eventually actually goes away. Alexander knew that, not in exactly those same terms, but he knew that by directing and being conscious of what we're doing, we can change what's happening. In fact, he wrote a book entitled The Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, which is really very insightful. Now, a bit technical, but very good. So I hope you get the time to try this. Ideally, do it once a day, and preferably twice. Don't extend it beyond 20 or 30 minutes per time. And really just focus on what's going on, not worrying about the rest of the world. If you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below. I'll keep an eye on this video for a while and try to answer them. And if you want a free copy of this talk, or the notes on the lie down, further notes on the lie down and the breathing, you can get them for a free download on my website, www.niallkelly.net/CPI. And if you're interested in exploring the Alexander technique with a teacher in your area, there's a directory of teachers at www.ISATT, the Irish Society of Alexander Technique Teachers.ie. I wish you the best of luck with it. Thank you.